A sharp wind whipped through the crowded park, rustling the leaves and sending dust spiraling across the pavement. Families ambled past, children's laughter echoed. Yet amid the clamor, Sergeant Nathan Cole stood rooted to the spot. His heart thundered, a raw ache pulsing in his chest. His gaze was fixed on a figure, or rather, a soul, he thought he'd lost forever. At the edge of the bustling path, an elderly man sat hunched on a weathered bench, his gnarled hand gripping a crude leash tethered to a gaunt, scruffy dog curled at his feet. The dog's fur was tangled and filthy, each rib starkly outlined beneath a frail layer of skin. But there was no mistaking those amber eyes. Eyes that once blazed with loyalty and valor, now clouded with pain and exhaustion. Nathan's breath hitched. He took a trembling step forward, then another, as if afraid to shatter a fragile illusion, until he was close enough to trace the faint scar etched along the dog's flank, a mark from a past only Nathan could fathom. "Ranger," he whispered, his voice breaking, nearly swallowed by the hum of the crowd. The dog's ears twitched. Slowly, agonizingly, he raised his head, his dim gaze meeting Nathan's. For a fleeting moment, time held still, but it wasn't reunion's joy that hung between them. It was the sorrow of a spirit slipping away. Then Ranger let out a feeble whimper, a sound so faint it barely rose above the park's clamor. His tail twitched once, a ghost of a thump against the dirt. Nathan's legs buckled. His polished boots scraped against the dirt as he reached for the dog. But before his fingers could brush Ranger's matted fur, the old man lurched forward, planting himself between them. His weathered face twisted into a scowl. "What do you want with him?" the man demanded, his grip on the makeshift leash tightening until his knuckles whitened. His voice was thick with defiance, edged with a protective snarl, though a shadow of doubt flickered in his sunken eyes. I I know him," Nathan stammered, his voice fracturing under a tide of grief. "He's mine!" The old man's head jerked back, his lips curling into a bitter sneer. "No, he ain't. He's been with me for months. Months I spent feeding him scraps, keeping him alive when the world didn't care." Nathan clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. Rage and despair clawed at his chest. "You don't understand," he pleaded. His voice trailed off as memories surged to the surface. Memories of gunfire, blood-soaked fields, and a bond forged in the crucible of war. He swallowed a sob, fighting to steady himself. "Please, just listen. You need to know who he is, why I can't abandon him again." The old man's gaze hardened, unyielding. For an agonizing moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by Ranger's shallow breaths. Then with a grunt, the old man shook his head, his shoulders rigid with resolve. "No," he snapped, tugging the leash to pull Ranger closer. "I don't trust you. You left him once. Why should I believe you now?" Nathan's breath hitched, his jaw locking as tears stung his eyes. He sank lower, his hand hovering inches from Ranger, who stared back with dim, weary eyes. What he didn't realize yet was that this wasn't just about reclaiming his lost partner. It was about uncovering the truth behind Ranger's abandonment. And as the pieces began to fall into place, Nathan knew one thing for certain. Justice would be served. But first he had to earn back the trust of the dog who had once given everything for him. Before we dive in, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We'd love to know. Welcome to Animal Dream Story. We're on an exciting journey to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Please like, share, and subscribe to be part of this tale. Now let's step into the story. The park pulsed with life around them, laughter and footsteps blending into a distant hum. But for Nathan, the world had shrunk to a single, fragile thread. Ranger and the old man standing between them. His hands trembled as he knelt beside the dog, brushing away dirt and grime from Ranger's matted fur. Each touch felt like a betrayal. How could he have let this happen? How could anyone leave such a loyal companion to suffer like this? Ranger whimpered softly. His tail thumped weakly against the ground. It was a shadow of the enthusiastic wag Nathan remembered, but it was enough to break whatever restraint he'd been holding on to. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered, "I'm so sorry, boy." I should have been here. The old man shifted, his boots scuffing the ground. His weathered face tightened, etched with guilt and defiance. He crossed his arms like a shield, his eyes darting away from Nathan's raw anguish. Listen, he growled, his voice rough and low. I don't care who you are or what you're after. This dog's mine now. I've fed him, kept him breathing when no one else bothered. He's all I've got left. Nathan's head snapped up, his gaze piercing through the tears. His voice held firm, though it trembled with a storm of grief and fury. He's not just some stray you picked up off the street. His name's Ranger. He served this country with me, years of it. You can't fathom what he means, not just to me, but to every life he saved. He's dying here, and you're keeping him from me. The old man's brow furrowed, his grip on the leash tightening until the rope bit into his palm. Served? What are you going on about? He's just a dog. No, Nathan shot back, his voice a jagged edge that made the old man recoil. He's more than that. He's a hero, and someone threw him away like trash. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, pierced only by the far-off giggles of children and the whisper of leaves in the breeze. The old man's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as Nathan's words struck deep. But instead of relenting, he squared his shoulders, his voice dropping to a stubborn growl. I don't buy it. You've got a story? Prove it, day after day. I won't hand it over until you prove it's true. Nathan's chest heaved as he fought to steady himself, the sting of rejection burning in his throat. He forced a ragged breath, his voice low and trembling with buried pain. It was 6 years ago, he started. His voice was low but filled with emotion. We were deployed overseas, part of a special operations unit tasked with high-risk missions. Ranger wasn't just my partner. He was my lifeline. We trained together, fought together, survived together. There were nights when I couldn't sleep because I knew we might not live to see the morning. But every time fear crept in, Ranger was there, watching my back. He stopped, dragging a shaky hand through his hair as the past roared back. There was one mission. It changed everything. We were sent into hostile territory to locate insurgents hiding in an abandoned village. Intelligence said they were armed and dangerous, but no one expected how bad it would get. Nathan's gaze drifted to Ranger, who lay quietly at his side. His breathing was shallow but steady. We were ambushed. They came out of nowhere. Bullets flying, explosions everywhere. I didn't even realize I'd been hit until Ranger dragged me behind cover. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be sitting here today. He saved my life and countless others. But he paid the price. That scar on his side, Nathan pointed to the faint line along Ranger's flank. That's from shrapnel. He refused to leave my side, even when medics tried to pull him away. The old man stood rigid, his face a mask of stone, though a flicker of unease softened his glare. Nathan's voice faded, leaving a hollow quiet. The old man scrubbed a hand over his weathered cheeks, his question barely a whisper. Why did they take him away from you? He asked quietly. Nathan's jaw clenched, a flare of fury igniting in his eyes. Budget cuts, he spat, the words bitter on his tongue. They said he was too old, too injured to keep serving. They reassigned him. Where? I never knew. I begged them to let me adopt him, but they told me he'd be taken care of. Turns out, taken care of meant dumping him somewhere when he stopped being useful. The old man's gaze dropped to Ranger, a flicker of shame crossing his lined face. I found him months back, he murmured, his voice a hoarse rasp. Wandering the streets, half dead, starving, dragging that leg. I couldn't walk away. Took him in, fed him what scraps I had, patched him up as best an old fool could. Thought I was doing right by him. You did, Nathan said, his tone steady but laced with desperation, locking eyes with the man. But he's not meant for streets or a stranger who doesn't know his scars. He belongs with me, where he's known. The old man's face hardened, his fingers tightening around the leash. He wavered, caught between the bond he'd forged with Ranger and the weight of Nathan's claim. But after a long, heavy silence, he shook his head, resolve stealing his voice. Number I've kept him this long? You want him? Show me he's yours. Not with words, but time. I ain't letting go till I'm sure. Nathan's breath caught, a pang of anguish twisting his gut. He nodded stiffly, swallowing the protest clawing up his throat. Fine, I'll prove it. Every damn day if I have to. The old man grunted, turning away, tugging Ranger's leash as the dog's head lolled weakly. Nathan sank back to his knees, his hand outstretched but empty, watching them fade into the park's crowd. Tears burned behind his eyes as he whispered to the air. I'm here now, buddy, he whispered. I won't stop till you're with me. The days after that first meeting stretched into a quiet, grueling test for Nathan. Each morning he returned to the park, a weathered bag slung over his shoulder, inside a scrap of chicken, a frayed blanket, a toy he'd knotted from an old shirt. Ranger lay at the old man's feet, his amber eyes dull, his frame a fragile outline against the bench. The old man's glare met Nathan every time, hard and unyielding. At first, Ranger barely stirred. His nose twitched at the food, but his head sank back, too weary to move. The old man scoffed, kicking the toy aside, his voice sharp. He don't need your pity. Yet Nathan kept coming, rain or shine, his boots scuffing the same path. He'd sit on a nearby stump, murmuring old commands. Stay, boy, easy now. His voice soft, steady, a thread reaching for the dog he'd lost. Days turned to weeks, and slowly Ranger's ears flicked at the sound. One damp afternoon, he dragged himself forward, sniffing the blanket, then nosed it closer to the old man's legs, a small, shaky step. The days that followed stretched into an agonizing wait for Nathan. It took weeks of quiet persistence, carrying food and blankets, for the old man, already weakened by his failing health, to finally relent. The reunion didn't close a chapter. It tore open a wound Nathan couldn't heal. Ranger was a shadow of the dog he'd known. Years of neglect and suffering had carved deep into him, body and soul. The German shepherd, who once faced gunfire without blinking, now flinched at the creak of a floorboard, his spirit shrinking into a shell of fear and exhaustion. In his small apartment, Nathan carved out a corner for Ranger, a soft blanket folded into a bed, a bowl of water, a meager offering of food he'd hoped might tempt him. But Ranger turned away, his appetite long dulled by a life of scavenging filth. His coat hung dull and tangled, hiding protruding bones and muscles, atrophied from hunger. Even lifting his head seemed to drain him, his breath shallow and uneven. Yet in those amber eyes a faint glimmer lingered, not trust, but a weary recognition, a whisper of their past that cut Nathan deeper than silence. Each morning Nathan knelt beside him, hands trembling as he combed through Ranger's matted fur, picking at knots with a gentleness born of guilt. The scars beneath told tales of valor, jagged lines of shrapnel and struggle, but now they mocked him, reminders of a debt he'd failed to repay. He spoke in hushed tones, voice cracking as he dredged up memories. The missions, the blood, the nights they'd clung to each other in the dark. Ranger barely stirred. His eyes stayed locked on the floor, distant as if weighing whether this man's voice was a promise or another lie. Time slipped too fast. A tentative flick of Ranger's tail, a weak press of his nose against Nathan's palm. These were scraps of hope Nathan clung to, though they faded with each labored breath. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, Nathan resolved to try more. He fastened a leash to Ranger's collar, its weight bowing the dog's neck, and guided him down the stairs, step by halting step, to the empty park nearby. Ranger's legs trembled, his body swaying, and Nathan's heart sank with the realization. This wasn't renewal. It was a farewell he couldn't admit. The open expanse of the park unsettled Ranger from the start. His ears drooped, and he froze, paws sinking into the earth as if it might swallow him. Nathan dropped to one knee beside him, his voice a soft, trembling murmur. It's all right, boy. You're with me now. We'll take it slow. They inched along the empty path, Nathan matching Ranger's faltering gait. Every step is a silent prayer. Gradually, the tension in Ranger's frame softened, his legs trembling less with each move. When Nathan paused by a sparse patch of grass and bent low, coaxing him forward, Ranger managed a halting shuffle, nose twitching faintly at the ground. For a fleeting second, Ranger's tail gave a weak, unsteady wag. This was the Ranger he remembered, the brave, curious soul who had always pushed forward, no matter the odds. But the illusion shattered fast. This wasn't revival, just a dying ember flaring before it dimmed. He understood too well. No walk, no whispered promise could stitch back what years had torn apart. That night, as Ranger collapsed onto the blanket, his breaths ragged and thin, Nathan sat close, clutching the blanket like a life preserver. He scrolled through old photos, each a stab of memory. Ranger in his glory, standing proud at Nathan's side in training drills, bounding over hurdles and even lounging lazily in the barracks. One photo caught his attention, a candid shot of Ranger mid-bark, his teeth bared in mock aggression as Nathan laughed in the background. It was a moment of pure joy, a glimpse of the life they'd shared before everything fell apart. But mixed among the happy memories were darker ones, images of war-torn landscapes, blood-soaked bandages, and the haunting faces of comrades lost. Nathan paused on a particular photo. Ranger lying in a makeshift medical tent, his side wrapped in gauze, eyes half open, yet piercing through the coal. That mission, the one where Ranger had dragged Nathan from death's grip, had carved wounds too deep to mend. Now gazing at the frail figure wheezing just feet away, Nathan couldn't help but wonder how much of Ranger's suffering could have been prevented if someone had cared enough to fight for him. The next day he carried Ranger to a nearby vet, clinging to a shred of hope for proper care. The vet's verdict was a quiet knife. Ranger's body was a ruin beyond repair. Years of starvation had hollowed his bones. Untreated scars had festered into permanent damage, and a sickness, silent and relentless, had taken root. "He's got days, maybe weeks," the vet murmured, offering pills to ease the pain, but no miracles. As they left, Nathan's fingers brushed a worn collar and found a faded tag, its etched numbers barely legible. He scribbled them down, a spark of purpose flickering through his numbness. Those digits might unravel why Ranger had been discarded, and who was responsible. Back home, Nathan poured every fleeting second into Ranger, as if love could claw back time. He knelt beside him, voice cracking as he whispered old commands. "Stay, boy, just a little longer." Each word a plea trembling on the edge of collapse. He tossed a tattered ball, its threads unraveling like their days, but Ranger could only nudge it with a nose too weak to chase, a shadow of the soldier he once was. Strength was a memory. Ranger's amber eyes faded, their spark drowned in a tide of exhaustion that pulled him under. Yet Nathan couldn't stop, driven by a need that gnawed at his bones, not just for truth, but for one more moment, one more breath. Whoever had tossed Ranger away would answer to him, even if the fight came too late to pull his friend from the dark. That truth seared into him the night Ranger slipped away, his final breath a ragged shudder, a soft whine fading as Nathan clutched him tight, the blanket soaked with tears that wouldn't stop. He buried his face in Ranger's fur, the scent of earth and war still clinging faint, and sobbed, "I'm sorry, buddy. I'm so damn sorry," as the silence swallowed them both. Late one night, alone now, Nathan sat at the kitchen table, the empty bed a silent wound in the corner. He stared at the crumpled paper with the tag's numbers, fingers tracing the ink. Ranger was gone, but the card remains a mystery. His grief hardened into resolve. He'd confront the system that had failed them, and his own guilt for not clawing Ranger back sooner. The journey ahead was not one of healing, but a lonely trek through the ashes of what he had lost. Nathan clenched his fists, knuckles whitening as rage smoldered beneath his grief. Someone had betrayed Ranger, someone who'd owed him a debt of honor, not abandonment. Ranger was gone now, his last breath stolen in Nathan's arms, but the tag's faded numbers burned in his mind, a tether to the truth he couldn't let die. The next morning, he dialed the number, each ring a hammer against his raw nerves. A gruff voice finally answered. K9 Relocation Services. His tone was clipped and impersonal. "Hi," Nathan rasped, his voice fraying as he fought to hold it together. "I'm trying to track down information about a dog named Ranger. He's a German shepherd, Retired military K-9. I think you might have handled his case. There was a pause on the other end. Hold on, the man muttered, followed by the sound of shuffling papers. After a moment, he spoke again. Yeah, we processed a dog matching that description a few years back. Transferred ownership to a private contractor. Why do you ask? Nathan's jaw tightened. Who was the contractor, and why wasn't he placed in a proper home? We don't handle placement detail, the man replied defensively. Our job is to reassign retired canines based on their condition and utility. If he wasn't fit for service anymore, it's not our problem. Nathan's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. Can you give me the name of the contractor, please? I need to know what happened to him. Another long pause. Then reluctantly, the man provided the name of the company, Apex Defense Systems, along with an address located hours away from the city. Before Nathan could press further, the line went dead. His resolve hardened in the quiet that followed. Ranger's empty bed loomed before him, a wound that wouldn't heal. He'd go alone. No friend to lean on, no one to share the weight. This wasn't about answers anymore. It was about facing the faceless cowards who'd let Ranger waste away, in the part of himself that hadn't fought hard enough. Ranger was gone, his frail body cold in Nathan's memory, and that loss clawed at him with every mile he drove. He couldn't shield him now, couldn't undo the years stolen, but he could face the ones who'd thrown him away. As he drove toward the address, his mind raced with questions. What kind of operation would discard a decorated war dog like Ranger? And how many others had suffered the same fate? When he arrived, the sight of the facility sent a chill down his spine. It was a sprawling compound surrounded by high fences topped with barbed wire. Its gates were guarded by men in tactical gear. The sign outside read Apex Defense Systems in bold, imposing letters. Nathan approached cautiously, flashing his military ID when challenged by the guards. I'm here to inquire about a former K-9 under your care, he explained, keeping his tone professional despite the storm brewing inside him. After some reluctance, he was escorted into the main office, where a sharply dressed woman greeted him with a cold smile. How may we assist you, Sergeant Hayes? She asked. Her voice was smooth but devoid of warmth. I'm looking for information about a dog transferred to your custody, a German Shepherd named Ranger, Nathan replied, leaning forward slightly. He served multiple tours overseas and saved countless lives, including mine. Yet somehow he ended up abandoned and starving on the streets. Care to explain how that happened? The woman's smile faltered for a split second before she regained her composure. Ah, yes, Ranger, she said. Unfortunately, due to his age and injuries, he was deemed unsuitable for continued service or adoption through our program. We attempted to place him with suitable handlers, but none were available at the time. Nathan snapped, slamming his fist on the desk. You dumped him. Don't insult me by pretending this was anything less than negligence. Her expression hardened. Watch your tone, Sergeant. Our organization operates within strict guidelines. If a dog can no longer perform, we make arrangements accordingly. And arrangements means leaving them to rot? Nathan shot back. His voice rose. These animals gave everything for us. They deserve better than being discarded like trash. Before the argument could escalate further, another employee entered the room, whispering urgently into the woman's ear. Her demeanor shifted instantly, and she stood, smoothing her blazer. Sergeant Hayes, I believe we're done here, she said. If you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to. Dismissed but undeterred, Nathan left the facility, seething with rage. On the drive home, his thoughts churned. Apex wasn't just negligent. They were complicit in a system that exploited working dogs until they were no longer useful, then cast them aside without remorse. But Nathan wasn't about to let them get away with it. Back home, Nathan pored over documents and records related to K-9 retirements, uncovering disturbing patterns. Countless dogs like Ranger had been reassigned to private contractors, only to vanish from official records shortly thereafter, lost to shelters, streets, or graves. It wasn't just his story, it was a quiet massacre. Guilt gnawed deeper, entwined with a resolve as hard as stone. He'd failed Ranger once, but he could still fight for the others left behind. Ranger was gone, his blanket just a sad memory in the corner of the room, but Nathan channeled that absence into action. He put together a tribute with photos of Ranger's scars and a video of his week, uploading them online with a caption that cut, "They served, we forgot." He fired off messages to veterans, advocates, anyone who'd listen, his words raw, demanding the truth be dragged into the light. One night, as support trickled in, comments, shares, echoes of outrage, he sat alone, the silence pressing in where Ranger's warmth once had been. Purpose flickered, not as a soldier or savior, but as a lone voice for the voiceless. He knew the battle was just beginning. Unearthing rot like apexes would take more than posts and pleas. They'd claw back with all they had. Yet staring at the empty space where Ranger's amber eyes once met his, Nathan swore to press on. This wasn't just for Ranger. It was for every unsung soul who'd given everything, only to be buried in silence. The days following Nathan's confrontation with Apex were tense but productive. Armed with evidence and testimonials from other veterans who had faced similar betrayals, he began building a case against the company. Yet as he worked tirelessly to expose the truth, his mind kept drifting back to one particular mission, the one that had cemented his unbreakable bond with Ranger. It wasn't just a memory, it was a scar that throbbed, unhealed, long after the dog's last breath. One still evening, alone in the dim light of his apartment, Nathan's gaze fell on an empty spot, the blanket where Ranger had lain, now folded and untouched. His fingers twitched, itching to trace the jagged scar he'd once run his hand along, the one he'd shown the old man that first day. Without meaning to, he spoke into the silence, voice rough and laden with grief. "You remember this, don't you, boy?" he whispered, staring at the void. "Afghanistan, that damn village. God, it's burned into me." No amber eyes met his, no head lifted, just the echo of his own words, heavy with the ghost of understanding he longed for. Taking a deep breath, Nathan leaned back against the couch and let the memories wash over him. Flashback, the mission that changed everything. It was the middle of the night when the team received the call. Intelligence reports indicated insurgents were holed up in an abandoned village on the outskirts of their zone, stockpiling weapons and planning attacks. The mission was clear: infiltrate, gather intel, and neutralize the threat if necessary. But nothing could have prepared them for what awaited. Nathan and Ranger ghosted through the dark, steps locked in rhythm from years of trust. Ranger took point, nose cutting through the murk for traps, while Nathan watched their back. The air was thick with tension. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential enemy. They reached the center of the village without incident, but as they approached a crumbling compound, everything changed. An explosion rocked the ground beneath them, sending debris flying in all directions. Nathan threw himself to the ground, arms curling over his head as gunfire shredded the night. The ambush was savage, unrelenting, bullets slicing the air, pinging off stone, choking the dark with dust. Fear gripped him as the trap closed tight. They were boxed in. "Ranger!" he yelled, voice raw, eyes darting through the coal. Amid the smoke and ruin, he glimpsed Ranger crumpled near a heap of debris, still as death. His pulse seized. "No, no, no!" With a desperate surge, Nathan clawed across the dirt. Bullets zipped past his ears. Reaching Ranger, he found blood pooling into the dog's fur, a cruel shard of shrapnel buried in his flank. Yet those amber eyes burned wide, locked on Nathan alone. "Stay with me, buddy," he begged, tears cutting tracks through the grime as he pressed trembling hands to the wound. "You're going to be okay. Just stay with me." Ranger whined, a faint broken sound, but stayed put as Nathan hauled him to cover. Even injured, the dog refused to leave Nathan's side, a shield to the last. With Ranger's help, Nathan managed to take down 2 insurgents who had flanked their position, buying enough time for reinforcements to arrive. When the medics finally pulled Nathan away, Ranger fought against them, straining to stay close. It was only when Nathan promised, "I'll come back for you," that the dog relented, collapsing into unconsciousness. That night, he swore no one would tear them apart again. Yet years later, that vow lay shattered. Ranger lost to neglect, reunited only to slip away in Nathan's arms. Back to the present. As the flashback faded, Nathan wiped his eyes, surprised to find tears streaming down his cheeks. The couch beside him was empty. Ranger's weight is a shadow he can't escape. In that hollow silence, a truth sank in. Ranger had been more than memory. He'd been loyalty carved in flesh, resilience against all odds, a hope Nathan hadn't guarded well enough. Guilt gnawed deeper still. He'd let Ranger down, not fighting fierce enough to keep him when the system turned its back. Now, with nothing left to lose, he'd make it right, or burn trying. Nathan's resolve hardened, a cold steel forged in loss, as he turned back to the papers strewn across the table. He knew exposing Apex wouldn't bring back the years Ranger had lost, but it could ensure no other K9 suffered the same fate. Over the next few weeks, Nathan worked tirelessly, collaborating with journalists, advocacy groups, and fellow veterans to shine a light on the systemic neglect of retired working dogs. Their campaign gained traction quickly, sparking outrage and calls for reform. Photos of Ranger, his scars stark against his faded fur, his final faltering steps captured in grainy frames, became the movement's haunting emblem. Ranger was gone, his blanket a silent sentinel in the corner, but his memory stood firm, a testament to a bond broken by neglect, not time. His spirit hadn't faltered until the end, and that unshakable loyalty drove Nathan on, even when the fight seemed impossible. And then one day, the breakthrough came. A major news outlet published an expose detailing Apex's unethical practices, complete with leaked documents and first-hand accounts from whistleblowers. Public pressure mounted, forcing government officials to launch an investigation into the treatment of retired K9s. For the first time in years, Nathan allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. But as the dust began to settle, Nathan knew the real work was just beginning. Justice for Ranger, and for all the forgotten heroes, would require more than headlines. It would take action, policy changes, and a commitment to honoring the sacrifices these dogs made. Alone at the table, Nathan's eyes drifted to the empty space where Ranger once lay. No wagging tail, no amber gaze to meet his. His lips moved in a whisper, barely audible. "We're not done, buddy. I'll keep going. For you." His faint smile was a ghost, tinged with the weight of a fight that would never bring Ranger back. The months that followed the expose were a whirlwind of change. The investigation into Apex Defense Systems revealed a pattern of negligence and abuse, leading to widespread reforms in how retired K9s were treated. New legislation was introduced, mandating proper medical care, rehabilitation, and placement programs for working dogs after their service. Advocacy groups bloomed nationwide, kindled by Nathan's lone stand and Ranger's shadow. Justice for K9 became a rallying cry, uniting veterans, animal lovers, and lawmakers in a shared mission to honor the unsung heroes of military and law enforcement. His victory, if it could be called that, lived in memory, the faint echo of a tail's wag, a bark swallowed by time. Ranger was gone, his loss a wound that turned pain into a quiet, unyielding purpose, a ripple that might spare others the same fate. One crisp autumn morning, Nathan drove alone to a local park. It was a dedication event organized by a newly formed nonprofit, Paws of Valor, a group dedicated to supporting retired working dogs and finding them loving homes. At the center of the park stood a bronze statue of a German shepherd mid-stride. Its head was held high, and its eyes were fixed forward. Beneath it, words etched in stone. "To the loyal companions who served without question, protected without hesitation, and loved without limits, you will never be forgotten." The crowd hushed as Nathan neared the podium, a solitary figure against a sea of faces. Veterans in crisp uniforms, families with adopted K9s, kids chasing dogs across the grass. No Ranger sat beside him. No gleaming coat caught the sun. Only the urn, cold and still, bore witness. "When I found Ranger," Nathan began, his voice a jagged thread, thick with unshed tears, "I didn't just find my partner. I found a debt I'll never repay. They don't ask for medals or recognition. All they want is to serve, to protect, and to love. And when their duty is done, they deserve nothing less than the same loyalty they gave us." He paused, his gaze dropping to the urn at his feet, It's cold metal, a cruel substitute for Ranger's trusting eyes. He taught me courage, yeah, but more, he taught me loss. I let him down, and he's gone now. I can't forgive myself, but I can fight so it doesn't happen again. That's what this bond does. It scars you awake. The crowd erupted into applause, but Nathan quickly raised a hand to quiet them. This isn't just about Ranger or me. It's about every dog who has ever worn a badge, carried a pack, or stood guard in the darkest hours. These dogs aren't tools, they're family. And it's our responsibility to make sure they're cared for, not cast aside. Kids ran past, their laughter sharp against the barks of other dogs. Later, as dusk bled across the sky, he walked a lonely trail outside town, the urn cradled close. The air bit with the scent of leaves and damp earth, but no eager trot led the way. No tail wagged, no glance met his, just silence. Through battles, betrayals, and a reunion too brief, their bond held, unbroken in memory, forged in fire, tempered by a love he'd failed to save. At the crest of a hill overlooking the town, Nathan paused, his breath catching as he stared out. Lights glimmered faintly below, a distant pulse of lives shifted by his fight, a fight too late for Ranger. Somewhere down there, other dogs might find homes, second chances he couldn't give his own. But here it was just him, the urn clutched tight against his chest. No warm fur, no steady heartbeat beside him. "You're my hero, boy," he whispered, voice breaking on the wind. "Always were, always will be." In life, we often forget the silent sacrifices made by those who stand beside us, whether human or animal. But true heroes don't seek recognition. They simply give everything they have. This story reminds us to honor those who serve, to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, and to cherish the bonds that heal us when we need it most. Because sometimes the greatest acts of bravery come not from battlefields, but from the choices we make to protect, nurture, and love. What did you think of Nathan and Ranger's journey? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an update as we bring more tales like this to life.